Καλώς ήρθατε στην ανοιχτή συζήτηση που θα γίνει για τις εικόνες της κρίσης. Welcome to the open discussion, which is part of the Photo Biennale, and it's entitled Images on Crisis. So this open discussion aims at generating dialogue and bringing to the fore open questions regarding images on crisis of any nature, whether that is financial, religious, or political. How artists and curators perceive a crisis, how they experience it, if this can be represented, and if indeed they choose to represent it, and of course, how the public reacts to it. These are the open questions we shall try to tackle. The Greek financial crisis is just a springboard to touch upon crises that are presented in various regions of the world. Our guest speakers here will give us some input on this aspect from their experience and from their expertise. We have planned this event to be an open discussion, and there will be no presentations apart from a very brief outline set by Sotirios Bahtsetzis, sitting on my right, who will give the first spark. Sotirios Bahtsetzis is a Greek independent curator, an art historian theorist based in Berlin, focusing on issues of visual representation, and he will talk about his ongoing project entitled Interviews on Crisis. Peggy Amison, sitting right over there, may bring in her knowledge from the international photography scene, perhaps also by pointing out examples from Irish artists, but also in addition to that, from her new position as Artistic Director of East Wing in Dubai. Peg, perhaps, we shall see, may give us her perspective of curating in the tumultuous environment of the Middle East. Sérani, Artistic Director of the Rencontres de Bamako for the editions of 2009 and 2011, and this year's Artistic Director of Mois in Paris, having lived the worst crisis of them all, after Mali was destabilized, may illuminate us on how curators and artists tackle the crisis in Africa, what the public expects to see, both international and the African public. Apart from this experience, as Laura will present the Mois in Paris this November, the ongoing Greek group project entitled Depression Era. This was also presented in May in the Photo Biennale at the Roman Forum. We also ask her to comment on that. Katerina Stathopoulou, Assistant Curator of the Photography Department of MOMA, may give us her point of view regarding the way crises of a different nature, such as the September 11 terrorist attack, brought about artistic movement and debate. This is merely a rough outline of our guest's background on this topic for you to have more information and join the discussion. The aim is for the speakers to pose questions to themselves and to us. No answers will be given. Hopefully more questions will be raised. So the floor for his brief presentation is to Sotirios, and then to open the discussion, first to the speakers and then to the floor. Sotirios.
Thank you very much for the invitation to Mr. Athanasiadou and Mr. Diarchimidis. Basically, the reason I'm here is to give you a very brief example of how people in Greece, that means intellectual, artists, journalists, people basically that work, let's say they have been affected by a very important financial debt crisis, as you know, beginning in approximately 2009, and actually emerging also to a political crisis, that is a crisis of representation within the European Union, as well as a social or even humanitarian crisis, and in the end, a crisis of actual representation in terms of a political representation, but also a representation as we use the word in, let's say, visual studies or the history of art as images. This is also the reason why the whole panel, it's called Images on Crisis. I would like to give you a very brief example of what we do. This is just one of possible examples. This is the project I'm working on, and it has the title Interviews on Crisis. It began 3 years ago, approximately, and actually it has been conceived here in Thessaloniki, creating an umbrella of major institutions throughout Europe, and having as a main, as I said, focus to, first of all, explore, decode, and try to analyze what this crisis is about. I assume all of you will have the same problem as we had in the very beginning of that project. That is, who can you trust? Let's say this is the major question. How do we have our information? How do we have our, let's say, background on what crisis is. Do you trust the media? Do we address the images presented in the media? Do you have to ask journalists? Do you have to ask the politicians that talk about that and try actually to, let's say, find in their own way a possible, say, solution? Is it your own eyes? Is it, let's say, your own experience, and so on? So it starts, let's say, from a very simple, from a very basic fact, as a need to, as I said, to understand and map, decode crisis. So I will give you here a very brief example. As I said, interviews on crisis. Basically, it's more like slogans, words, and images. The whole project, as I said, is an umbrella project, including various institutions. We basically start with brainstorming in different areas, including, as I said, various institutions. We're currently working with the University of Post-Industrial Design in Basel, Switzerland. And we conduct exhibitions, we conduct workshops with students and in public sphere, different events. And here you have a very brief, let's say, outline of that. This is from a workshop that we did. I will not give specific information. As I said, there are various workshops. This is like one of them. This is the starting initiative workshop in Basel. As we said, we have chosen the medium interview as being one of our ways to understand, as I said, to map, to decode crisis, and interviews in terms also of, let's say, gathering information. Our aim is to create an archive, a European archive on crisis, and this is the reason why we, in a way, we go from place to place, let's say, gathering this information, putting this information together, and then working on them. The work that it has been done, and it still continues, is in two levels. The first is an academic research. We're working actually with the Department of Political Sciences in Thessaloniki, but also in terms of representation, in terms of, let's say, aesthetic outcomes. We work together with artists and creative individuals in order to create further, say, elaborations, further outcomes of that basic archive of information based on interviews. These are our main initiatives and workers. These are us. These are basically the first group. They're called, basically we called it GR Enter. If you remember, there was the discussion about the Greece exiting the Eurozone, so we thought, well, what a better thing to do than to name it GR Enter. Some of our collaborators and people that we're working with. As I said, we see crisis as an opportunity. We don't want to basically just, let's say, make this map, but also envisioning a future, envisioning not only a future for Europe, for Greece, but also a future for Europe. And in this case, let's say, our basic tools are is this research. Hyperwork is the institute that, as I said, we work together in Basel, Switzerland. One of the workshops that we have conducted with students, there's a series of workshops. You see all the post-it there. It's basically starting from the scratch, not having any preconception, not having any theory. Of course, we work with theories, but the idea was to start with, let's say, interviewing ourselves, how we feel about that, what do we self-believe about that, and so on. You see how students work, kind of like visual mapping of, let's say, ideas. I believe in one of them you will find also the Chinese ideogram about the word crisis, which in Chinese actually means something different. It's composed out of two words. The one is danger and the other is opportunity. Put together, the word means crisis. Another one. So you might see that we're here in the Museum of Photography. That was a workshop held here in the Museum of Photography with the School of Architecture. As I said, we work with different various schools. That was interesting. Just to give you a brief example, we researched not only interview per se, but also the format of interview. So we basically asked, let's say, students, how do you think you can gather information? So, well, of course, one of the most, let's say, mainstream medium would be microphone, and then you collect views. But then we had also an architectural workshop that students propose different ways of, let's say, having a setting of the interview. Not, as we say, the SATs, for example, the microphone, table, chair, and so on, but we have different micro-architectural projects. Some of the students, for example, said, well, we can do that on a boat. Some other propose different various views of actually changing the attitude of the interviewer and the interviewee. These are, for example, some of the plans that came out. The interview format. Vienna was one of our workshops, also working there with the Design Academy. And of course, various presentations during the Art Athena, the last Art Athena, we had a short presentation. A presentation in Thessaloniki at the BIET, which is the bookshop of the Cultural Foundation of the National Bank in Greece, where we will have a setup of a studio and inviting actual personalities of the city of Thessaloniki. You might recognize some of them. And also having an exhibition. Where these are interviews conducted in situ, in the space there, process, post-production, and actually exhibited in the same day, in the same period. Another exhibition at the Museum d'Engeli, that was also a presentation of our project. As you see, the visual content of that, also based on the format of the interview. And that was my very short presentation. Well,
thank you.
Thank you very much.
So I'll take this opportunity and I'll ask the first question perhaps to Peg. So, as crisis and opportunity, as Sotirios just mentioned, well, one of the things you mentioned, or
crisis and opportunity. I think in the art world, anytime there's changes, anytime there's drastic changes in the financial structure of a country, it causes everyone to operate differently. So in the case of Ireland, which I can speak to with more experience than I can to the Middle East, it brought a lot of artists together, working quite strongly in ways that we wouldn't have partnered had we had different supports available, which were all taken away. Presently, the arts are, although they're heralded in Ireland as being a very important part of our economy, in that as an island as small as Ireland is, the cultural life and the history of Ireland is what draws people to the country. I mean, there's not very many countries where you can have someone the breadth of, say, James Joyce, or even something as popular culture as U2, where people are coming to Ireland to have an experience, to see the culture. And the government uses that as a way to promote the country, but they do not support development of new arts. I mean, the Arts Council is trying very hard, but they've been cut drastically over the past few years. So is it an opportunity? Of course, I think we always make the best out of a bad situation. So it's, I wouldn't say, I mean, it's an opportunity for us to work together, I suppose, is what I would say.
But would you think that artists use it in this way?
I know that in my experience in working in Ireland that I have seen artists work this way. They've come together in ways they wouldn't have otherwise. A lot of independent spaces have opened up. a lot of, well, for instance, there's an organization in Cork that's called Camden Palace Hotel, which was an empty building, and a French guy who's been living in Ireland for quite a long time decided that he wanted to make an art center. So he organized for it to be a space for artist studios. The artists pay a nominal rent, but through that and through a very strong community aspect, a community life within this building, they've been able to run all different kinds of events, from theater to film screenings to art exhibitions. So yes, I think that in that case, you know, I have really seen it. There's a number of organizations throughout Ireland that have come together in ways that I don't think they would have had there been different structures in place.
And Katerina, is it the same? I mean, would you say it's the same in New York, where we would have thought that you know, the structures are much better? So when something big happens, like a crisis, does this bring on different debates and artists think in a different manner?
Definitely. I also think, you know, when we first discussed the topic of crisis, I was a little intimidated because I've been living in New York and I've been absent from the Greek crisis. But immediately what came to my mind was a different kind of crisis, such as the terrorist attacks during September 11th, which was my first week of university as in Washington, D.C., or you know, the crisis of a natural disaster like we had last year with Hurricane Sandy. And out of both occurrences, the terrorist attacks and Hurricane Sandy, I can say that something that Peggy touched upon, how it becomes a unifying element for people. The most characteristic example I can think of is when the terrorist attacks happened on September 11th. The next day, some individual, an unknown person, posted, taped a picture that they had taken on the storefront, an empty storefront in Soho, New York. And then that became sort of an impromptu memorial, and people started walking by and posting their own pictures there. That grew to this colossal project that named Here's New York, a Democracy of Photographs, where over 4,000 pictures were collected. They had to expand from the storefront, and a nonprofit space in Soho housed it. And they had 3,000 visitors a day coming to look at these images. So you have 4,000 images, and it wasn't professionals. It was passerbyers, amateurs, police officers, and some of them had to do with the events of September 11th. Others had to do with, you know, family photos. Just everybody could express themselves the way they wanted to. And I just think that's a beautiful example how something so horrific can become a unifying factor. And it became, in a way, a memorial artistic project.
But Sotirios, would you think that this is also the benefit of art? I mean, having this democracy of photographs that Katerina just mentioned before, there can be a slight danger of opening up and having everyone discussing about the crisis. I mean, but perhaps this is the definition of art itself, or not? Is it like a dangerous ground we're now walking on? That we have, we can trust upon amateurs and non-amateurs, and everyone should talk about the crisis?
Well, this is actually a very big question. I mean, there are also like views about, let's say, in order to open it up, also like the question of the medium itself. Because I said in the beginning, like crisis, of course, we're working on crisis, let's say, also in the project, but it's a crisis not only as, let's say, regarded as a financial, social, humanitarian, climate crisis, of course, terrorist crisis, and so on, or a systemic crisis. There are a lot of, let's say, different views, and there are different, let's say, approaches. Actually, the basic problem is a problem of representation in terms of understanding it. As I said before, who would you ask? Would, let's say, the view of an economist would be enough for you? I don't know. I believe not. So, let's say, the problem there is like, you know, to find your way through a labyrinth of discourses, find your way through a labyrinth of possible interpretations. So that's the one thing. The second one, and of course this is a big discussion about, I don't remember the name, but it's described as the digital Maoism. I know he's a New Yorker who basically wrote a book about that. In our days, everybody can post something, everybody can make a film, everybody can, you know, have his own view on Facebook, social media, and so on. So the question there is a question about, let's say, making, say, creating a network of information and then the distribution of that. So the question of authority, the question of, let's say, if you want, also the question of truth. I would say that both of them are actually, in a way, opening a new era. I believe that we can also talk about the crisis of art in general. That means art that has to reinvent itself also, and reinvent itself in a more, let's say, 2001 democratic condition. That means, of course, you're open at the discussion. On the other side, art, as we know, it's always an issue of selection of possible issues, selection of institutions, selection of views. I see that as a laboratory. This is the time of rethinking. This is the time of new, let's say, setting new orientations. What will come out of this, I cannot give you an answer to that. Also, our project here is actually more or less a project of like, let's start talking about that. We don't have any specific goal. I mean, of course, we have, let's say, we know what we want to do, but we don't say that we're going to create a kind of like new encyclopedia on the 21st century. However, I do believe this is an essential moment. It's a very important moment. I think everybody in Greece has that view already. It doesn't have to be within the arts, but also normal people that had actually the opportunity to, in a way, recreate their own life. I'm also talking about social issues, time banks, shared labor, and so on. These were actually things that, you know, wouldn't exist in Greece before. And now, or let's say some years ago, they become a necessity. So, on one side, you have a kind of like, let's say, different development in society, but also, as I said, you have an opening of the discursive field. New things might happen. Let's leave them also emerge. And you know what the institutions of the 22nd century might think of that. That's another issue, I believe.
So, Lara, I don't know if you agree with what has been said, but how did you make your choice for including the Depression era in the Modula photo in November?
Je vais parler en français et Barbara va traduire. Une des sections du modèle à photo cette année, c'est la Méditerranée.
Ένας από τους τομείς λοιπόν της φωτογραφίας φέτος είναι η Μεσόγειος.
Et quand on parle de Méditerranée, évidemment, ce qui nous tient à cœur, c'est d'avoir la vision la plus complète possible, qui va de la vision littéraire, romantique, jusqu'à une vision très actuelle et concernée sur la situation économique, sur les problèmes des migrants, etc. Et donc avoir une vision de ce que c'est la Méditerranée aujourd'hui.
Και έτσι λοιπόν όταν μιλάμε για τη Μεσόγειο, αυτό που θέλουμε είναι να έχουμε μία άποψη όσο το δυνατόν πιο πλήρη. Και μιλάμε για μια άποψη η οποία μπορεί να είναι λογοτεχνική και να φτάνει μέχρι σήμερα, μέχρι το τώρα, μέχρι την κρίση. Και να βλέπουμε λοιπόν πώς είναι η κρίση στη Μεσόγειο.
Et la Grèce étant aujourd'hui un pays, un des premiers entrés en crise, représenté, comme vous disiez, un des laboratoires aussi, qui est intéressant aussi pour le reste de l'Europe, ça nous a paru très intéressant d'aborder la Grèce de ce point de vue-là. Et,
έτσι λοιπόν η Ελλάδα είναι η πρώτη που αντιμετώπισε την κρίση και νομίζουμε ότι ήταν πραγματικά ένα πείραμα πάνω στην Ελλάδα και θέλουμε να δούμε λοιπόν τι υπήρξε στην Ελλάδα μέσα από την κρίση.
Et le projet de Depression era est exactement tout, un peu les parallèles du travail dont vous parlez, c'est-à-dire un groupe, une collective de 20-25 artistes, photographes, directeurs artistiques, écrivains, etc., qui se posent la question de comment réagir face à la crise aujourd'hui, de comment parler de la crise et de produire une information différente de celle officielle qu'on peut voir à la télévision, etc. Donc c'est la question. Je vous laisse traduire et après je dis juste un mot.
Oui. Και έτσι λοιπόν αυτό που θα ήθελα να πω έρχεται και συμπληρώνει κάπως αυτά που μόλις πριν μας είπατε. Εγώ έχω να σας πω ότι υπήρξε μια ομάδα από 25 καλλιτέχνες, οι οποίοι ήταν φωτογράφοι, ήταν γραφίστες, καλλιτεχνικοί διευθυντές, ήταν επίσης συγγραφείς και οι οποίοι μίλησαν για την κρίση και θέλαμε να δούμε την κρίση διαφορετικά. Θέλαμε να δούμε πώς η κρίση επηρεάζει τη ζωή μας, όχι όμως με τον τρόπο που την βλέπουμε μέσα από τις ειδήσεις.
Je pense que la crise et la différence, bon, enfin, on ne parle pas de l'Afrique maintenant, mais par rapport à les effets principaux de la crise, ils sont d'une part sur la production elle-même, de l'information, des images, sur la production artistique. Là, ça suffit de penser aux conséquences, par exemple, avec la presse, l'impossibilité de produire des sujets, donc la nécessité de s'inventer de nouvelles façons de produire. Et d'autre part, il y a une autre conséquence aussi qui est attendre directement les préoccupations des artistes et des créateurs.
Έτσι λοιπόν, αυτό που θέλαμε να δούμε είναι τι συνέβη σε ό,τι αφορά την καλλιτεχνική παραγωγή μέσα από την κρίση. Γιατί βεβαίως υπήρξε ένα πρόβλημα σε ό,τι αφορά την παραγωγή των εικόνων, ακόμα και μέσα από τον τύπο τα πράγματα ήταν διαφορετικά. Θέλουμε λοιπόν να δούμε καινούριους τρόπους παραγωγής και μέσα από αυτούς θέλαμε να δείξουμε τις δικές μας ανησυχίες.
Et de Pressionir a fait ça, c'est-à-dire d'un côté, il se pose la question de comment produire, comment tirer il y a des photographes qui sont dans la salle d'ailleurs qui pourraient parler du projet mieux que moi, mais d'une partie comment produire cette information alternative et comment aller chercher, documenter des aspects aussi cachés de la crise et des conséquences sur la vie des gens et sur la réorganisation de la société.
Και έτσι λοιπόν αυτό που θέλαμε μέσω αυτού του project ήταν να δούμε πώς μπορούμε να παράγουμε μια καινούργια πληροφορία εναλλακτική, πώς μπορούμε να την τεκμηριώσουμε, πώς μπορούμε να μιλήσουμε για τη ζωή των ανθρώπων μέσα από την κρίση.
Et d'autre part, sur la façon de traduire tout ça, donc sur de nouveaux supports et de nouveaux moyens de diffusion qui ne sont pas les systèmes classiques de la presse, de l'édition, des expositions, mais imaginer aussi des nouvelles formes de restitution de cette production photographique, film.
Και επίσης θα θέλαμε όλα αυτά να τα μεταφράσουμε μέσα από καινούργια μέσα διάδοσης της πληροφορίας και να μην αρκεστούμε στους παλιούς τρόπους που είναι ο τύπος, η φωτογραφία κλπ. Αλλά να δούμε πώς μπορούμε να αποκαταστήσουμε αυτή την καινούργια πληροφορία μέσα από καινούργια μέσα.
I was thinking of asking a question to Yorgos Prinos, if he doesn't mind, as part of the Depression Year project. Yorgos, how easy do you think it is for you to participate in such a project and talk about the crisis when you're, I mean, not only you, but also the artists participating in the project, and not of them being trapped in the representation of it and just bringing to the fore a stereotype, perhaps, of what others expect of you for the crisis?
First of all, the whole project started as a need for all the artists to start understanding the phenomenon of crisis.
Just one second.
The whole project started as a need, as Sotirios was saying, for all these artists to understand the phenomenon of crisis. And I think it was a great, that need brought all these people together to really start a dialogue about trying to understand what this phenomenon that they are experiencing. And that, I think, is a great pretext for all of us to start again meeting each other in a real sense of work, to really start understanding what was happening. Can you tell me again the question?
If you ever feel trapped that you have to fulfill a stereotype of how other people see the crisis, and then you start engaging in that, and then what you create goes in that line of thought.
Yeah. I think most of the artists trying
so if the laboratory actually works.
For us, it's a kind of a collective experiment. So we try to see the crisis in a very different perspective, in a way to avoid the white noise of the media, the official image of the crisis. And through all these different perspectives, you see how every human, every artist tries to tackle with this phenomenon, this crisis. So, for example, you can see that a lot of these artists are putting the camera back to themselves. So we have a lot of people that are trying to do something about their family. And I think the family is a very central element to the crisis. For example, because of the bond of the Greek family in Greece, there is a great mechanism of defense about dealing with the crisis. So there are many different conclusions in a way you can see. Something else that is very interesting is that you can see a breadth of approaches in a way. All these different approaches, it's a reflection about the medium itself. So you see very different approaches like a kind of photojournalism, the relation of image and text, video, different kinds of gestures like appropriation. So we have very different elements. And I think also with all the things that we are trying to do is also to reveal the process, because through our meetings and our discussion, we are trying to understand what is happening, and we are trying to give answers to ourselves. So there is a lot of things, trying to understand.
How easy is for you to detach yourself from all this mass media, though, and to, it's probably the best way to go is what Sotirios was presenting before, just to get to the source, which is pure information, and then just try to see how this is represented. But for you as an artist, the process, how easy for you is it to detach yourself from, because still you're processing information from what you're seeing. So it's having this point of reference of family, or? Of
course, but that's always a very difficult,
in general.
Yeah, of course. So I think also with the process of meeting the other every time, everybody brings a new element onto the table, a new experience. And I think, again, the sense of trying to really meet the other, it's a very important element. And I think with this different kind of approach for everybody, to try to discard, all this white noise again, and you try to go a little deeper and deeper to what is happening.
Okay.
Can I say something?
Definitely.
Do you need the microphone?
Definitely, it's coming up.
Thank you. What Mrs. Stathopoulou described is for me a healing process, because, okay, shall I say it again? Yes, please. Okay. What Mrs. Stathopoulou described sounds like a healing process, like it started of non-artists, it started of people who work in the area, I think, and then the state observed all of it and was clever enough to collect and make it a piece of art. So the enemy came from abroad. It was a clear danger. It wasn't like we live in Greece, a hazy atmosphere. For you Americans, it was very clear, came from outside. In Greece, it is inside, it is not clear. The danger comes from inside, from outside. And what is the healing process for people who do not belong in a safe environment, like an organization? Thank you.
So you're, so it's more of a comment than of a question?
It's both. It's what comes in my mind, because now I realize what's going on, what was going on with.
But every crisis of any sort makes you wonder about things. I mean,
Not question, but we have on the one hand the process, the healing process, that everybody's open to participate and to find a solution, or not solution, any kind of, to face the problem. And it's not a question, it's not, I'm not saying it's bad or good, it's just like,
just a description, yeah.
just a description of what now comes in my mind.
Okay. Yeah, please, anyone.
No, I was going to say, coming from Ireland, I mean, I'm American, but I've lived in Ireland during this whole period. I can see the comparison you're making, but I think in terms of Ireland, what we saw from the crisis, because it hit us in 2009 as well, is what I was describing earlier as this coming together, which is very similar to what we were talking about, what happened in New York as well, where, like I was saying, project spaces started to come up and we started working together. And I think in that way, it's kind of a healing process in that You have artists, a lot of emerging artists, making work about what they're seeing and what they're experiencing, people leaving those states, the same things that you have here, and finding ways to show that work, whether it's through a collective experience or whether they're just putting it out on the street. I mean, also in Berlin, there's a project called Kleister, where they choose a subject and they curate a number of people to come out and they wheat paste images on the wall, and then they have their opening in the street and they go away and they leave the pieces there to see how they disappear. So again, it's this community working together in times where maybe we feel powerless in some way. So it's similar to the September 11th example, but it's this idea that, and I think that's kind of, for me, it's what the arts are about. The arts are about communication and about working together from a very different place, sometimes from a very logical and other times from a very emotional place, and usually from a very emotional place. But then with the advent of new technologies, we're able to do lots of different things and communicate much quicker, and maybe the communication isn't always, or let me say maybe the communication sometimes is quite messy, but it's this need to connect.
I would just like to add on to that I think you're really right in what I hadn't thought of it before, but we're talking about crisis as an opportunity, and in terms of the art, I feel that it's the artistic projects that have come out of any kind of crisis brings art closer to the community. It's bridging a gap. We're not talking about, academic painting of Velázquez anymore. We're talking about art for the people, from the people, for the people. And in that sense, it's just become a lot more approachable, but also more humane.
Would you do that? Oh, sorry.
Just want to comment, because I love what you said about healing process. And I would like maybe to add in something, because I gave the impression that I'm totally against any kind of representation, that I hate images, and this is not the case, obviously. I mean, we're talking about the mainstream idea of representation, but we actually use ourselves images in order to counteract that. And it reminds me, of course, of the well-known essay of Roland Barthes, Camera Lucida, which is an essay on photography, but it's also an essay on a healing process. That is, photography itself might be also the medium for that. So in order to, let's say, defend photography or defend representation, we're also in a museum of that. However, the ways that these, let's say, this healing process appears might be different. There's another Greek artist working in Hamburg right now, Margarita Somo, that she has created a visual archive of all images, or let's say the majority of images collected by smartphones in various occasions, for example, the Indignados in Athens and so on, and basically saying that the idea of non-representation, of crisis still remains. However, what we can do is actually to show this non-representational aspect of that situation by collecting all those different various thousands privately made subjective views and counteract them or put them against the mainstream images we have from the news and the media. And this by itself, this kind of like antagonism is in itself, I would say, a kind of like healing process.
But isn't that also quite a danger? Isn't there a danger behind this? I mean, the gap that we have this feeling that mass media always shows or doesn't show anymore things that we should be informed about, and that all of a sudden artists come to the fore and they bring in the information that we are that doesn't come to us. So all of a sudden art seems to be filling up this gap, and then we are using these artworks as what though? As a piece of information, as news, but the criteria is shifting, and all of a sudden it's not aesthetic anymore, it's journalism, but you can't actually see it as a piece of journalism. So isn't that a bit dangerous to you or to anyone? Do you feel that there might be a danger of all this openness, because all of a sudden art is becoming journalism, but not by journalists? So it's a different set of rules. Just a very conservative point of view, just to attack and just to create a bit of, you know, dynamic?
I'm not sure if you have understand your question, but if the question is as an artist who became a journalist more than artist and creative, I think there is a different way and several ways to document reality. And now we have a new language for the photography, for the production of the reality and the documentary, and so is not a risk. The artists very often have been engaged in their processes of creation, so the language is not a problem. And I think the border between information, between journalism, between production are very less clear than before, in reason of the digital, often also not the problem of the diffusion of the image, of the people are in place. If you see what happened with the Printemps Arabe, the spring in the country of the Maghreb, everybody take pictures and everybody diffuse pictures under for rank because journalists are not there. So there is a confusion of roles and confusion of the roles of people today. But these things save sometimes the missing of information and the missing of pictures. And in Africa, we speak of crisis, but our crisis is a normality in Africa, because all the problems are big and biggest in the reports of Europe. And the real problem, the real crisis is war and famine, the phenomenon of the normal crisis in Africa. But the first, the most important is to tell about all this story. It's the possibility to document and to show what happened in all the area of Africa and the more hidden. And so internet was a real solution for the information for that. Yeah. I wanted to say.
Can I also say that this is not the first time that photography is truth or is not truth has ever been raised. It's the ongoing conversation that we have been talking about since the advent of photography. So to say, in these new technologies, is it unsafe? And I know you're kind of playing devil's advocate. It's the question that we've been asking since, it's just before we had to wait for the pictures, and now we don't, and they, sometimes the photoshopping was done in a much longer process, but still there has always been this manipulation. So that's always going to be a problem. I mean, that's always going to be this, and the immediacy of smartphones and the fact that now they're looking at ways of blocking those phones. So, I mean, what's going to happen? And is that censorship, or is that protection? How do you see that then? When they say, oh, there's a new app that the police are going to use, and when there's a demonstration going on, they're going to just cut all the iPhones so that they can't, of course, I'm sure within time they'll find a way to override that app, because, that's just the nature of what we do. But is that protection, or is that censorship? What is that?
But I'm not talking about images that come up in the press or on the internet, but those that come up in exhibitions and in museums. So I'm not actually wondering whether that's truth or not truth, but when you see it in the museum, you actually buy it, that it's it may be the truest possible aspect of the crisis. So it becomes a political statement in an art institution in a time where you have no other information on something where you think you don't have any. So,
but I still think in art, there's anytime, if you're talking about putting something up on a wall in a gallery and somebody buying it, I mean, it can be a fabrication at any point, and yes, maybe what you're talking about is a piece of art that is supposed to be representing the crisis, but that can be symbolic as well as documentary. So it's kind of a broad net you're throwing out. But I mean, I see what you're trying to get at, but I still think once you put something on the wall and it's art, and it's, it's that question of truth, going back again, what is truth and what what do we need to protect ourselves from, and what are we, what sort of responsibility do we take when we put something up on a wall in a gallery, as a curator, as an artist, as a consumer?
Katerina, what do you think?
In response to what you're saying, I think just the way we can't, you're comparing art to the news or fact, but just the way we can't take anything that we see on the news or read in the newspaper at face value, I think it's the same way in the arts. It's all about interpretation. We have to have the filters to judge, make our own judgments, even, and I think, if we're looking at something and considering it a piece of art because it's exhibited instead of printed in the press or viewed on the television at the evening news segment, just because it's in an art environment or gallery or foundation, I think that even that makes it easier for people to realize that this might be a personal interpretation of an event. I think the real danger is when the same, even maybe the crisis, the way it can be represented on the television news or in newspapers, I think that could be more dangerous.
Definitely. I mean, we have here also an example, like the family of man being one of the very important, let's say, crossings between art and photojournalism. And at that time, it was very appropriate, I think, your presentation. It was exactly, let's say, initiation of that discourse. On that questioning, is it art or is it not art? Is it about, let's say, reality or not reality, and so on. So we, of course, in the arts, we always have that. We have to cross boundaries and move forward. If it is a crisis, it's not a crisis of those who make the photographs, but it's a crisis of the filters, of the institutional filtering, of the institutional presentation. And of course a crisis of the interpretation. Okay. However, I mean, I believe, of course, there are differences. There are like art historians, visual theories who talk about the difference between strong and weak images. A strong image would be an image that, let's say, has the opportunity of being interpreted in various ways. It's always an art like that. If you have a kind of like a Shakespearean play, you can, it was nice at that time, but it's still beautiful. I mean, it, let's say, invites different ways of interpretation. And I believe this is also the case with all media. This is also the case with digital photography or new media art and so on. So, and again, basically, the question would be addressed to the curators and, let's say, institutions.
Do you feel that the public has the filters? Has those filters when they see, an exhibition on a crisis, and it seems very political. They do understand that it's subjective matters, and it's not. And they don't draw information from that because they feel that the other information they're getting is not enough. You don't feel that sometimes nowadays art is substituting this gap, and it's still two distinctive things, and you just with different conventions, and you still understand. I mean, in theory, I understand. Does it happen in practice, or do we feel that I'll go there and this is the alternative view, and all of a sudden I'll be informed because it's an artist and he has sensitivity and he understands more? No.
I think that is one of the dangers. But on the other hand, if we're talking about a Greek audience, it's impossible that they would only be affected by one exhibition they saw about the crisis. So. I think that this is true for any kind of information, whether it is visual, factual, that people can misinterpret things. But I don't think that by any means that we shouldn't, because we're living through a crisis now, I don't feel that we shouldn't talk about the crisis. We shouldn't have exhibitions. We shouldn't have artistic projects coming out of it just because they might be misinterpreted.
Yeah, definitely.
So maybe I don't need the microphone? Okay, so maybe I do.
Okay, so picking up on what Katerina said about the Greek audience, and for example, when you're in Greece, you don't expect to see one exhibition addressing the issue of crisis. So I was thinking that nowadays, that Greece is quite exotic with the financial crisis and everything. It's a new trend. It's something that happens. to actually promote the current artistic practice abroad through exhibitions and addressing the crisis that we have here. So I was thinking, so that's a huge responsibility. So if you're a festival or you're an institution, do you do that? I mean, how do you address the crisis that happens somewhere else? Is it maybe too much to do that? Is it too dangerous? Or, I mean, I think it's a very dangerous step because you either recreate the stereotype or then you might not be present. I mean, it's what Sotirios actually said, that who do you trust for the information in order to address something? So it's not actually a question, it's more just a thought, but I'm sure that you're the right people to address it to.
Open to the floor. Demande de se présenter le prix aujourd'hui présent en Grèce, c'est une grande responsabilité que de rentrer dans les stéréotypes. Oui, c'est ça, c'est exactement ça. Si vous voulez.
For me, it's absolutely normal to show the problem around the world, and between more the several problems, there is a problem of crisis today, and in Greece is a moment very strong, you know, the problem of all Europe. So for me, it's normal. It's not a risk, and it's a risk to fall in a stereotype. I don't think so. I think it's our responsibility to show the reality, what happened, and to faire confiance aux artistes, to trust the artist, to talk about the story that touching everybody. Apologize for my English.
So, maybe sometimes
I don't know if you can understand.
Perfectly. Thank you very much. Maybe sometimes it depends on the country and where you see it from, because we're having this discussion yesterday with Sena, who comes from Istanbul Modern, and I don't know if you would like to comment on that, Sena, what we were saying yesterday during dinner. At some point, that people expect to see the exotic crisis of, say, Turkey or the Middle East or Greece, and sometimes this doesn't actually coincide with what we are experiencing.
Thank you. Maybe we can talk about the Gezi Park protest, that a recent experience that we lived on a crisis, and there are lots of going on after the Gezi protest as an artistic moment, and some of the exhibitions that been held after the protest was very organic, and was by the artists or just by the people, initiated by the people. Like an example, making human chains and holding some pictures from the Gezi protest, or hanging the photographs in the park during the forums. And it was very organic and very close to the protesters. But at the same time, just after the Gezi protest, we had the Istanbul Biennial, and a few artists interpreted Gezi Park protest in the Biennial. And it was so, as far as I talked with the people, and as far as I know, and most of the people didn't like the representations of the Gezi protest in this biennial, because it was too foreign, and it was like a shallow and not sincere. But after we had also lots of photography exhibitions, but it was too descriptive, maybe, and it was already the pictures that everyone saw on the social media or in the newspapers, and it was not interesting. But I can say that as an example, what we made at the museum, we already planned this exhibition before Gezi Park protest, but it was a good timing and not a coincidence, maybe. Now we are showing an exhibition of a photography agency called NAR Photos It's a photography agency very well known for their democratic and libertarian view, and kind of popular in by people in social media, etc. And it's an agency of 10 years, celebrating the 10th anniversary. And we showed the 10 years of Turkey from their perspective. And we showed also the 10 years of the current government. And we showed also in this exhibition the background and the reasons that Gezi protest happened. What are the main issues of the Gezi protest? Such as the minorities, the issues of the minorities living in Turkey, the issues of the workers, labor force, cheap labor force in Turkey, and also urban transformation, which is the main problem and cause for the Gezi protest. And also we showed some pictures, some photographs from the Gezi protest. Just to remember after 1 year, and to give the feeling of fear and also the victory that will lead at Gezi protest. But it's not the exhibition was not about the Gezi protest, but you can follow the traces which are going to lead this uprising, which is a great important moment in Turkey. And maybe it can be a case for this discussion.
Thank you very much. What are you thinking? I'm seeing nodding.
No, just making notes actually.
Because this is actually what Ray was doing. You're working for 10 years and then you have the exhibition. This is what you will probably be doing, maybe not for 10 years.
Well, basically the idea now with the, let's say, with the laboratory would be not to stay on that, let's say, level of, creating new images. They might, images might come out, but not necessarily. This is the idea. I mean, on one side we'll have, of course, a kind of like archive of those interviews, but that would be in a kind of, as I said, a kind of like mainstream or conventional even archive. But this is the very first level. What we want to do is then, let's say, continue, give the ball, to the other one, ask artists how to, let's say, work with this material, and ask them to create something different. That might be also probably not even image, or it might be sound, that might be an architectural micro environment, it could be a performance, it could be, whatever. Let's say it's an umbrella. We don't give the artists, let's say, guidelines. We say, this is the information, please work with that. So that creates a second level, or even a third level of interpretation. In this reference, I believe this is a creative process. I mean, it invites, again, artists. You said before, it is the artists that we should trust, and I definitely agree on that, even if it sounds very ideologically loaded. But I believe, as one of my favorite, let's say, mottos about what an artist is someone who has traveled to the future and he came back. And I believe this is the idea actually behind that.
That's a beautiful way to close the discussion. I don't know if anyone else would like to add anything, comment, or ask a question. Please, Amen.
My experience is from the field of literature rather than photography. And in presentations of the crisis in literature, particularly Greek, you hear very frequently the comment that you cannot write about the crisis while the crisis is still on. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if there are voices like that in the art world that insist that it's too early to talk about the crisis. Perhaps it's a follow-on from the lady from Istanbul who talked about descriptive pictures. I was wondering if there is this kind of discourse in the art world as well.
Katerina, Peggy, is it too early? How do you feel artists react?
Well, I think
are they mature
artists
enough?
always. I think a lot of artists respond. They respond to their environment. So I don't think. I think it's rare that they wait. At least not in visual art anyway. I mean, and I would say in performance as well, you would see reactions happening now. Is it too early? Of course there will be, in time as we will be looking back and we'll have digested and be able to see it a different place. But I think there's a lot to be said for what's happening in the moment. For reflecting and responding to what's happening in the moment. And maybe in the future, like many other things, we can look back and say, oh, they were wrong there and there, or that was weak there. But I think it's the energy, it reflects the energy of the time. It's sort of like in the 60s, the whole peace movement that happened in the 60s, maybe that was a bit messy in ways as well, but it was a reaction to a time, to a new mindset. It's sort of like what you were saying about a new model, a new way of talking about things with new tools.
Just say something just briefly, because actually I would like to reverse the argument. Newly I did an exhibition and then I've collected some works. The idea was also to comment, let's say, sidely, also parallel to this issue of the crisis. Then there were 3 or 4 works there in the exhibition, and I said, well, that's great. That's actually about what's happening right now, or, And then I'm checking the date, and these were works actually made in 2006, 2008. I think this is a strong argument for what I said before, of like an artist actually somehow, not even the artist, maybe the work itself, envisioning the future.
And just to add on to what you said, it also, just going through what we're going through now, your interpretation is probably very affected by the current crisis. And frequently things just seem very timely, even though they were, made generations ago.
You say you want to add something, or you find it?
No, it's out of context, but I don't know, maybe it's out of context, but it's interesting, I think. Being a tutor sponsored by a program from the Arcos Foundation, and this program is for, unemployed. Thank you. Unemployed people who have graduated from universities, age 30 and up. The words of gratitude that they write, that this program offers, that they have the tools to photograph or to express themselves artistically. So maybe this is an idea.
We visit this morning.
Yes, I know, I couldn't, but the words of gratitude were not present because they were in the form of mail or personal, or so this is maybe a